Well, now the water's back onto the house. I don't see any drips around the edge. When we leave the homestead in the winter time, when it's going to be cold, we turn off the main valve at the tanks. That way, if we have a pipe break somewhere downstream, we don't lose all the water. So before we left, 10 days ago, 11 days ago, I turned off the water at the tanks. Just came up and turned it back on and double checked the places where it could freeze and might split a pipe. No splits, no leaks so far. That's great news. I'm going to go turn on the electric to the water pump. That's also turned off before we leave, just in case, because if there's a leak in the house or a pipe break's going to the house, I don't pump 7,000 or 2,000 or even 700 gallons of water into the house. And the water pump is turned on. That means we can start doing laundry, and we have a lot of laundry from that camping event.
Yeah, just a little bit of mud.
A lot of mud. Which is going to be an interesting challenge for our washing machine. It's a high efficiency washing machine, which doesn't use a lot of water. That means that we might have to run a tub a couple of times in order to get all the mud out.
And one of our next steps this morning is to check the greenhouse. Obviously we have to make room for the door to swing out, but while we were gone we just sort of battened it down. The original forecast was it wasn't supposed to get that cold. Then of course it changed because the weather has been very unreliable everywhere in the US this year. And we just kept everything covered because we find that our greenhouse gets a huge amount of solar gain, so if there is any heat out there at all, it does a pretty good job. We know that it got down to 6 degrees while we were gone at least one night, and down pretty close to that a couple of other times. So it's not shocking that we lost some of the seedlings. The seedlings are more fragile. As you can see, the spinach is in pretty good shape. There's a little bit of freezer burn, yeah. So a little bit of freeze burn on a couple of these things. Some of the ones that I had picked down super hard in here that were kind of fragile may or may not make it. But all this stuff, it'll come back just fine. I'll have to replant the radishes. This one that's on the floor actually has survived weathering this bad before multiple times. And you'll see, this has no heat at all, and yet, because it is in a larger container and it was covered, actually survived, including all the seedlings. So these are all carrots, and these are all radishes that were planted. I don't even think most of those had come up before we left. No, I don't think any of those had come up. These had come up here, but they were still in too fragile a state, whereas these guys on the floor, that's why people will tell you, if you have a hoop house, to put beds in the ground of it, or on the ground at least, and then cover it with yet another row cover, because every time you put a layer, it gives you a few more degrees of protection. And this box will naturally tend to retain quite a bit of heat. So yeah, everything in here survived completely fine. My preference is to have them on the table convenience-wise, but it's obviously ones on the floor worked better because they never had any heat all winter, and yet they've done just fine. Now they are slower than the ones on the table, but they also didn't freeze to death, so there is a lot to be said for that. Last year I did radishes, spinach, and carrots in that one, and that's all I had in here. No heat except for covering it up, and there were a couple of times when it was supposed to be very, very cold when I covered it with more than one layer, but because we were gone, I just had a piece of greenhouse fabric over the top of it that I inherited from my mother-in-law several years ago. So that was a roll that they had for using up in Maine, and it's kind of cool because it's got fibers in it. I actually don't see it for sale. It must be out there somewhere. It's sturdier than your average greenhouse fabric is. But it worked really well. It worked really well. Obviously, those radishes are still alive, and so are the carrots. It makes me think that maybe next year what I will do is forget trying to use heat mats to keep these things warm, because that does take power for us, and that's kind of a pain. And just deal with a slower growing season, but one that's a little less susceptible to frost. But obviously we've had several meals off of these guys, and if I really wanted to, I could pick some of these right now, but I won't. I'll let these guys have all their energy putting into surviving for a while. But we're toasty today, so I mean, it's not toasty outside. It's what did you say? It was supposed to be a high of 50.
53.
High of 53 today, and we're very overcast. But it's still up to 60 something in here just with the solar gain. So yeah, I would say it was a success. Not the blaring success that it might have been, but also not a huge failure. To me, getting any kind of greens in the winter is awesome, especially when it's 6 degrees outside or something. So yeah, it survived, and I was hoping it would. I kind of expected the one down there, the wicking bed, would, because it did last year, and it had no heat, and it had very little TLC other than me watering it once in a while. This was an experiment. We didn't know what was going to happen up here, and I suspect it worked just fine until the heat mats failed because the power failed. This is a professional heat mat here. I think this one's always supposed to run at 70. It has a real thermostat and everything to it. It's not the cheap piece that I have over there. So I'm pretty happy. I am pretty happy. I will replant the rest of the radishes this week, and we'll see where we go from there. I had planned to plant peas as soon as we got home. However, there's still about 4 inches of snow in the pea bed, so we'll wait as soon as the pea bed melts off. I am going to plant peas because that's our next experiment. I used to do that in Massachusetts. I would plant during thaw that happened in either January or February, and as soon as the snow was off and the ground was workable, I'd put the peas in and then cover them back up good with dirt, and it would snow on top of them for months sometimes. But the minute the snow was off in later spring, the peas would just sort of vault out of the ground. They were ready to go. So we're going to try that here too. Worst case, it doesn't work. No loss. So we lose a few seeds. But if it works, we're trying to grow peas before the season gets too hot, because as soon as our season gets hot, that's when the diseases show up, the bugs, all that sort of stuff, and peas just don't like our heat. So that's our next major experiment.